At night in Accra, the streets were silent, but inside a forgotten room at the edge of the city, Ayo and Nia lay side by side on a threadbare mattress. Their breathing was shallow, hearts pounding from a closeness that seemed ordinary, yet carried a weight neither fully understood. Ayo, barely 25, turned his head just enough to watch Nia, a flicker of satisfaction crossing his eyes. She didn't notice, the dim candlelight hid his expression perfectly. He knew something she couldn't, that this night, this moment, was not just passion, it was a choice that would bind her to a darkness she could not escape. Nia, also in her 20s, smiled softly, lost in the warmth of the moment, oblivious to the unseen chains closing around her. Every heartbeat, every touch, was a step deeper into a trap she could never imagine. What seemed like intimacy was actually the beginning of a ritual, one whispered about in fearful legends, where human desire became a gateway to unspeakable forces. The air in the room was thick, heavy with the scent of incense and something older, more primal. Shadows twisted along the walls as if they were alive, leaning closer to witness the pact being made without her knowledge. Ayo's lips curved into a secretive grin. He had played his part perfectly, following instructions older than the city itself. Nia shifted slightly, humming a soft note, completely unaware that by surrendering herself tonight, she had unknowingly invited a darkness that would consume more than just her body. It would reach her mind, her soul, her very essence, leaving only fear and the marks of a power that demanded tribute. Outside, the city slept, but the night held its breath. Somewhere in the shadows, creatures stirred, silent, hungry, patient. They had been waiting for this exact moment, drawn to the life that had been offered. And when the first scream finally cut through the darkness, it would echo far beyond the room, carrying the secrets of a ritual that had been hidden for generations. Ayo's eyes glinted in the candlelight. Tonight, the game had begun. And by dawn, nothing would remain the same. The room had grown colder, though the candle flickered as if trying to fight it. Ayo lay still, eyes half closed, listening. Every creak of the wooden floorboards, every soft rustle from the cracked walls seemed amplified, echoing like voices whispering secrets meant only for him. He knew the ritual required patience, precision, and fear. And tonight, fear would arrive soon. Nia stirred beside him, unaware that the room itself seemed to breathe around her. Shadows stretched across the walls, long and thin, moving independently of any source of light. For a moment, Ayo felt a flicker of nervousness, a rare feeling, but it vanished quickly. He had been taught that hesitation in moments like this could be deadly. The creatures were patient, but they were always watching. A low hum rose from somewhere deep within the room, almost imperceptible, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the bones. Nia shivered and pulled the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders, thinking it was just a draft. But Ayo knew better. The sound was part of the ritual, a calling, a summoning. From the corners of the room, faint shapes began to slither and writhe. Small, pale things, almost like worms, yet with a strange intelligence in their movements. Ayo's lips curved in satisfaction. He could feel the power gathering, like electricity in the air, the way a storm swells before it strikes. He whispered an incantation under his breath, barely audible, and the shadows responded. They twisted closer, pressing against the walls, the ceiling, and even the floor, until the room felt smaller, suffocating. Nia remained oblivious, humming softly, her dreams carrying her away from the horror slowly closing in around her. Outside, the city was quiet, but the night seemed aware of what was happening within that forgotten room. A dog barked far off, and a window rattled as if the wind itself was trembling in fear. But these were nothing compared to the hunger that now crept closer. The ritual had begun to awaken forces older than Accra itself. Forces that had waited for centuries for an offering to stumble unwittingly into their grasp. Ayo moved carefully, ensuring every symbol drawn in the sand around the bed remained undisturbed. One wrong move, one broken line, and the entire ritual could turn against him. He glanced at Nia again, her face serene in sleep, and a pang of something he hadn't felt in years passed through him, envy of her ignorance. Ignorance that kept her alive, for now. A sudden scratching sound echoed from beneath the floorboards. Ayo froze. Nia shifted again, murmuring in her sleep, The scratching grew louder, more urgent. Something was coming. Something had been waiting, and now it could sense the life that had been offered so willingly, so unknowingly. The shadows throbbed, and the low hum rose into a chant that seemed to seep into the walls themselves. Tonight, the game had truly begun. And by morning, nothing would be untouched by the darkness now stirring within that small, forgotten room. Ayo's heart thudded, but not from fear. It was anticipation. The first stirrings had begun. Beneath the rotting floorboards, tiny movements whispered of life that had lain dormant for centuries, waiting for a soul to cross into the circle. The scratching, once faint, grew insistent, a rhythmic hunger calling to the darkness. Nia remained blissfully unaware, her soft breaths and half-smile a cruel contrast to the shadows gathering around her. Ayo could almost taste the inevitability of what was coming, the way the air thickened, the faint metallic scent that preceded the arrival of the ancient forces. The room itself seemed to pulse, each heartbeat of the ritual syncing with his own. The first thing emerged from the cracks between the boards, pale, writhing worms, far larger than anything found in nature, glistening wetly under the candlelight. Their movement was deliberate, almost intelligent, as though they could sense exactly who was inside the circle. They crept toward the mattress, drawn to the life and warmth that Nia radiated in her sleep. Ayo's lips twitched into a private smile. This was the moment he had been preparing for. He whispered the final lines of the chant, and the worms paused, forming a semicircle around the bed, wriggling in synchrony as if marking their prey. The shadows clung closer to the walls, folding over themselves, creating shapes that resembled long-forgotten spirits. Then came the whispering. Not a voice, not fully human, something older, harsher, layered with hunger and malice. The words were unintelligible, yet they carried meaning. Nia's body stiffened slightly, but she did not wake. The creatures sensed her fear, her unawareness, the innocence she still carried. They were drawn to it. And once the first touch occurred, nothing would remain the same. Ayo's hand rested lightly on the edge of the bed, guiding the final alignment of the ritual symbols drawn in salt and ash. Every line, every curve, mattered. A small mistake could undo everything. He had learned that from the elders, long ago, a misstep had cost someone their life, consumed not just in body but in spirit. Tonight, he would witness it without error. The worms began to move again, wriggling up the side of the bed, pale bodies glistening and glinting like wet silver. Nia murmured softly in her sleep, and one reached her ankle. She shifted slightly, unaware that her very soul had begun to be touched, stretched, and pulled toward the hungry shadows. Outside the room, the city remained quiet, but within, the energy grew violent. The air vibrated with the presence of forces long buried in Accra's history, their hunger insatiable. Ayo's grin widened. Everything had fallen into place, and the ritual was feeding now on the first living offering. By the time the first scream escaped Nia's lips, soft, startled, it would be too late. The worms would no longer be just crawling, they would consume, and the darkness would claim more than her body. The night stretched on, suffocating and thick, carrying with it the promise of fear, despair, and a terror that would linger far beyond the small room in Accra. The candle flickered violently, as though struggling against a wind that wasn't there. Ayo's eyes followed the writhing forms inching along the floorboards and mattress, pale bodies glistening in the dim light. Nia's soft murmur had turned into an uneasy whimper, but she still didn't awaken. The ritual had begun to take hold. Ayo leaned closer, whispering a phrase in a language older than Accra itself. The words felt sharp, resonating through the floor and into the walls, as though the building itself had become part of the ceremony. The worms responded instantly, wriggling faster, moving in patterns that formed a terrifying design on the mattress. Their hunger was no longer subtle, it was precise, deliberate, and unnerving. Nia shifted, tossing a strand of hair from her face, and a faint mark appeared on her wrist, a tiny, pale symbol etched into her skin, though she had not felt it. It was the first sign. The ritual's magic was not just physical, it was spiritual, reaching into the essence of her being. The room grew heavier, air thick with tension, and the shadows began to lean closer to her, as though they were testing the limits of the circle. Ayo's heartbeat matched the rhythm of the creature's movements. His mind was calm, but a thrill ran through him, an exhilaration born from knowing he had become the conduit of something far older than humanity. This was no ordinary act. It was a pact, sealed by fear, desire, and innocence. Nia, unaware of the danger, exhaled softly in her sleep, her breath carrying the essence the ritual demanded. The worms climbed higher now, reaching her ankle, then her calf. Their movements were mesmerizing and horrifying at the same time, almost hypnotic in their slow precision. The symbols etched around the mattress pulsed faintly with a dim glow, reacting to the energy of life being siphoned. Nia's body twitched involuntarily, tiny involuntary jerks as if something invisible had begun to claim her from the inside. Ayo's lips curved in satisfaction, but his eyes flicked to the shadows on the ceiling. Shapes had formed there, elongated, twisted, resembling hands and faces that did not belong to the living. The whispers grew louder, layered voices chanting in unison, though no mouth moved. The shadows were alive, feeding off the energy of the ritual and the young woman's life force. Outside, the city slept, unaware of the ancient forces stirring in one of its forgotten rooms. The ritual demanded offerings, and the first was being taken with care and precision. The worms continued their slow ascent, leaving faint, glistening trails that marked the path of consumption. Nia murmured again, sleep stretching thin, and a flicker of terror flashed across her face in dreams she could not understand. Ayo adjusted a small talisman, pressing it lightly to the symbol etched in ash. A sudden chill swept the room, and Nia shivered violently. The worms paused, then surged in unison, drawn to the mark, to the life that had been unwittingly offered. Tonight, the darkness had begun to write itself on her skin, her soul, and her body. By morning, nothing would be the same. The shadows in the corners had grown thicker now, moving with a life of their own. The pale worms glistened like wet silver as they slithered along the mattress, leaving faint, writhing trails that seemed to pulse with energy. Ayo watched in tense satisfaction, knowing that the ritual was reaching a point of no return. Every movement of the creatures, every flicker of shadow, was a signal that the ancient power he had invoked was fully awake. Nia stirred, her eyes fluttering open briefly, but she thought she was dreaming. The room felt oppressively heavy, as if the very air had thickened with intent. She shivered, pulling the thin blanket around herself, unaware of the cold tendrils of darkness brushing against her skin. The faint glow of the symbols on the floor now illuminated her face, highlighting the fear she didn't yet realize was beginning to creep into her heart. Ayo whispered another line from the ancient chant, and the worms responded, wriggling faster, climbing higher, converging toward the small marks on Nia's body. Her heartbeat quickened, yet she could not fully wake. Her body was already responding to the unseen forces, muscle and nerve tingled as if something invisible was tracing her very essence. The shadows began to move independently, stretching and contorting across the walls and ceiling. Faces emerged, hollow eyes, gaping mouths, twisted in expressions of hunger and pain. Nia's breath caught as she tried to sit up, but the weight in the room pressed her back against the mattress. Panic fluttered in her chest, faint but undeniable, like a bird trapped in a cage she could not see. Ayo leaned closer, his hand brushing lightly against her shoulder. Not in comfort, but in control. He whispered another incantation that resonated deep within the floorboards, and the worms reacted immediately, wriggling in perfect formation. They were no longer simple creatures, they had become instruments of the ritual, conduits for the ancient energy now claiming Nia. A faint scratching sound echoed beneath the floor, and suddenly, a few worms darted along the edge of the mattress with astonishing speed. Their movement was no longer random, it was deliberate, precise, guided by some intelligence older than human life. Nia gasped, finally half awake, as she felt their first touch crawl along her ankle. The sensation was unnatural, terrifying, yet impossible to fight. Ayo's lips curled in a hidden grin. This was the moment when the ritual truly fed on the first offering. Outside, the night seemed to pulse, vibrating in sympathy with the ancient forces in the room. Every heartbeat, every whisper of air, carried the energy of life being claimed. Nia's eyes widened as she saw the shadows coalesce above her, their forms now unmistakably alive. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body was already partially consumed by the unseen forces. The worms wriggled up her legs with relentless intent, leaving pale, writhing traces, while the shadows above bent downward as if reaching to claim her fully. By the time the dawn touched the horizon, her life, her soul, and the room itself would be forever changed. The ritual had awakened, and there would be no turning back. The candle had burned low, casting long, trembling shadows across the walls. The room felt alive, pulsing with a sinister rhythm that matched Nia's racing heartbeat. She was fully awake now, but her movements felt sluggish, as though the very air had turned to water, holding her down. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet her body betrayed her, caught in the invisible grip of the ritual. The worms had multiplied, their pale, glistening bodies crawling up her legs and arms, leaving trails of wet, writhing marks. Each touch sent shivers of terror through her, and with every second, a creeping numbness spread from her limbs inward. She tried to scream, but her voice came out as a strangled gasp. The shadows above bent downward, long and twisting, forming shapes that resembled hands that were not human but alive with hunger. Ayo watched from the side, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. He murmured quietly, each syllable feeding the energy in the room. The ritual demanded precision, and every move he made orchestrated the creatures, the shadows, the unseen forces that had waited centuries for this moment. The worms obeyed him as if he were their master, wriggling in perfect synchronization toward the marks etched on Nia's skin. Nia's chest heaved. She could feel something inside her pulling, stretching, a tug at the very essence of her soul. The shadows above swooped lower, their shapes almost tangible, brushing against her hair, whispering unintelligible words that echoed in her mind. She shivered violently, trying to shake free, but the mattress seemed to have grown roots, pinning her in place. Panic and fear rippled through her consciousness as the worms reached her torso, climbing slowly but purposefully. The room pulsed with a faint, unnatural glow. The symbols on the floor throbbed like a heartbeat, feeding on her fear and life force. The air vibrated with whispers, chanting that seemed to emanate from every corner at once, resonating deep within her chest. Nia could feel the ritual claiming her, marking her, preparing her to be consumed by forces she could not comprehend. Ayo's grin widened. He had prepared for this moment, following the ancient instructions to the letter. The ritual had begun to feed fully, and the worms and shadows were no longer just instruments, they were extensions of the dark energy, living conduits of power. Every wriggle, every brush of shadow, drained a fragment of Nia's being, strengthening the forces now awakened in the room. Nia's eyes widened in horror as she finally understood, this was no ordinary night. This was a hunger older than the city, older than memory, feeding on the life and soul of a single, unsuspecting human. She tried to move, tried to fight, but the shadows tightened, and the worms pressed closer, their writhing forms marking her body like a map of terror. By the time the first light of dawn reached the cracked window, the ritual had consumed more than her innocence, it had begun to claim her very essence. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the room, unseen eyes watched, satisfied, waiting for the final act to unfold. The first rays of sunlight barely pierced the crime-streaked window, yet the room was alive with shadows darker than night itself. Nia's body trembled violently, limbs pinned by invisible forces. Every muscle, every nerve, screamed to escape, but escape was no longer an option. The ritual had entered its final stage, the consumption. The worms, now massive and writhing with unnatural energy, covered her body in a wriggling, glistening mass. Their pale forms pulsated, feeding, absorbing, and marking every inch of her skin. Each movement sent waves of agony through her consciousness, a sensation unlike anything natural. The marks left behind were not merely physical, they glowed faintly, symbols of the dark energy now entwined with her life force. Above, the shadows swirled violently, no longer just stretching along the walls but forming monstrous shapes, twisted faces, clawed hands, and hollow eyes, leaning over her with a hunger that was palpable. Nia's eyes widened in terror, realizing too late that this night had been a trap. The whispers had become voices, speaking in tongues older than memory, promising nothing but pain and transformation. Ayo knelt beside her, reciting the final incantations in a low, commanding voice. He did not touch her, he did not need to. The ritual responded to him, to the careful orchestration of symbols, gestures, and words he had prepared for years. Every line drawn in ash and salt vibrated with energy, pulsing in rhythm with the writhing worms and swirling shadows. Nia's screams finally broke free, raw and desperate. The worms climbed her torso, wriggling across her chest and neck, leaving glowing marks that spread like veins of shadow. The shadows above pressed downward, brushing her hair, her face, twisting her form with invisible hands. Her body was no longer entirely hers, it had become a vessel, a conduit for the ancient hunger now fully awake. The candlelight flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness broken only by the faint glow of the marks on her body. The air pulsed with energy, heavy and suffocating, and the whispers grew louder, surrounding Nia, pressing into her mind, searing images of creatures she could not imagine. She could feel her soul being pulled, piece by piece, into the writhing, hungry darkness. Ayo's lips curled into a triumphant grin. The energy in the room surged, feeding him as well, granting him power promised by the elders and whispered in prophecies. The worms had consumed more than flesh, they had touched her essence, binding it to the shadows, to the ritual, to him. And with every pulse, he felt the wealth, influence, and dark favor he had sought come closer to fulfillment. Nia's body arched, convulsing as the worms and shadows completed their work. The whispers became a roar, the shapes above solidifying into monstrous forms, marking her as theirs. And when the final pulse hit, the room fell silent, except for her ragged, terrified breathing, shallow and broken, the last remnants of someone she had been. The ritual was complete. The darkness had claimed her. And the city outside, still unaware, continued its sleep, oblivious to the horror that had just been unleashed in a forgotten room in Accra. The first true light of dawn crept slowly across the cracked window, but the room remained cloaked in a suffocating darkness. Nia lay motionless on the mattress, her chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. Her skin was marked with faint, glowing symbols, the final remnants of the worm's relentless claw. The shadows that had consumed her were gone, or perhaps merely hidden, watching, waiting for the next offering. Ayo sat silently on the floor, sweat clinging to his brow. The ritual had succeeded beyond expectation. He could feel the power flowing through him, a dark energy heavier than any he had ever known. His fortune, his influence, and the promises whispered to him by the elders were no longer distant, they were now within reach. But as he looked at Nia, a strange unease prickled at the edges of his mind. The room was silent, yet alive with residual energy. The faint echo of whispers lingered in the corners, and for a moment, the symbols on Nia's body pulsed faintly again, as if reminding him that the ritual was never truly finished. The worms, having disappeared, had left traces in the floorboards, tiny grooves in the wood that seemed to crawl with a life of their own. Nia stirred, a low, terrified whimper escaping her lips. Her eyes opened, but they were not the same. There was something alien in their gaze, a distant hollow look that spoke of consciousness touched and twisted by forces beyond human comprehension. She tried to sit up, to scream, but her voice cracked into a faint whisper, almost swallowed by the lingering shadows. Ayo reached for her, but she recoiled instinctively. Something about her aura had changed, she was no longer fully herself. The ritual had taken more than her body, it had claimed pieces of her soul. The worm's consumption, the shadow's hunger, and the chanting energy had left marks that could never be erased. Her presence now carried both life and the lingering darkness, a bridge between the human world and the ancient forces that had been awakened. Outside, the city was waking, unaware of the horrors that had unfolded in a single forgotten room. Birds chirped, traffic began, and the morning sun glinted off distant buildings. But within the walls, the echoes of the ritual lingered. The power had been unleashed, the first offering claimed, and the room itself seemed to breathe with a subtle, malevolent awareness. Ayo stood slowly, glancing once more at Nia. He felt triumph, yes, but also a creeping dread. He had followed the instructions perfectly, yet he sensed the ritual's reach was not limited to this night. The darkness had tasted life, and it would hunger again. Every success carried the price of unseen consequences, and the shadows were patient. They had waited centuries for this moment, and patience was their greatest weapon. Nia's whisper barely reached him, a sound that was both human and something else entirely. Her eyes flicked toward the floorboards, toward the empty corners where the worms had vanished. And then, faintly, a new movement began, a wriggling, subtle, beneath the wood, as if the ritual was not yet done. Ao realized, too late, that this night had changed everything. The darkness had claimed more than her. It had claimed a foothold, and it would not rest until every soul it desired had been fed upon. Accra, oblivious and bright in the morning light, had just become a city with a secret that would haunt it forever. The ritual was complete, but the terror had only begun. Subscribe and hit the bell, more forbidden secrets of Across Shadows await you.